Okay, cool. So I realised during Karen's talk that mine might be based on some factual inaccuracies. Maybe that's fine.
I think mine might be too.
Okay, great. That feels in keeping somehow. And I was going to try and continue the gesture and not cite any women. But then I realised it's actually really hard to say anything interesting if you don't cite women. So I gave up on that gesture because I'm clearly not as dedicated to the purity of gesture. And it's called On Deciding to Boycott Women in the Abstract. And I'm going to start it with 2 quotes from men. The first one is Wayne Kostenbaum in an essay on abstraction and figurative painting, and it's, is abstraction a transcendental escape from identity or a psychotic spasm of depersonalization? And the second quote is Charles Bernstein. I am a Jewish man trapped in the body of a Jewish man. What if On Deciding to Boycott Women was an abstraction? It might seem to be as far from abstraction as possible in that it removes all distance. The work is the action, is the subject of the work, a claustrophobic knot that it would be inaccurately spacious to describe as a constellation, the gaps so small as to be mostly filled with the dust of the objects. If abstraction is the realm of ideas rather than events, the gesture of boycotting women is surely not an abstraction, but rather a complete collapsing of the idea into the event, a total resistance to the notion that there is any worth in ideas without events, a total repudiation of representation. However, the rigidity of Lozano's premise pushes the action firmly over the edge into the realm of ideas. The women that Lozano boycotted in 1969 were not the women she boycotted in 1999. There was nothing contingent, no outside event that could push Lozano back into the world of women, or if there was, she evidently never experienced it. Although On Deciding to Boycott Women could be read as an intense act of representation, of moulding a life into a representation of a social dynamic, the ever-changing nature of existing in the world means that her representation is constantly impacting what is being represented, and is therefore not a representation of anything actually existing really, but the embodiment of an abstract principle. Working with the meaning where to abstract something is to remove a part from a larger body. Deciding to boycott women is almost definitionally an abstraction. Lozano attempted to abstract herself from social relations with other women, a bucket from the sea doomed to bitterly discover again and again the mechanics of evaporation and the water cycle, an ominous cloud of woman ready to suck her back up at the slightest hint of dispersal, a shallow puddle on a bright May afternoon. But plastic bucket and spade in hand, she abstracted herself again and again. To continue digging, we also have the meaning of abstraction as preoccupation, which seems reasonably applicable given how perpetually conscious of her decision Lozano must have been while maintaining it for 30 years. And I can never think about preoccupation without breaking it down into its constituent parts and thinking of occupation as in work and hearing the work that comes before the work and thinking about what it means to occupy oneself, or maybe more relevantly, how to refuse to occupy oneself, how to refuse to occupy one's assigned role in the world, and instead search for agency, for a preoccupation. But why think of it as an abstraction? Partially, I think it gives space to consider it outside of outrageousness, which is useful because it is, of course, outrageous. In the same essay on figure as the quote I began with, Kostenbaum brings up the rhetorical device of prosopopoeia, in which the speaker embodies another person or object, living or dead, to make a point, potentially a point that they themselves would like to make without having to take responsibility for the viewpoint as their own. Or, by another definition, a figure of speech in which an abstract thing is personified, or, in the case of deciding to boycott women, a figure of non-speech in which an abstract thing is personified. By formalising boycotting women as work, Lozano acts from the position of the object of the work. This allows a strange sleight of hand where the most intense personal decision is not really about oneself at all, a depersonalisation which happens to be exactly what it is to have a gender. The abstraction highlights the impossibility of a non-abstract equivalent. It is a necessarily incomplete gesture, highlighting the impossibility of an outside to gender, the impossibility of opting out. As with her dropping out of the art world, the act of attempting to opt out highlights the impossibility of the same. The disturbing truth highlighted by her leaving the art world, as evidenced by us sitting here today, is that it is impossible to leave. The act of leaving is recuperated as a gesture, as an extension of the work. There is no way out. The strange truth that both works highlight is that opting out is not opting out, or at least opting out of the compulsory is not opting out. This forces us to think of opting out as a gesture that is simply an altered mode of relation to the in. There is no pure abstraction. It's impossible to boycott women while women exist. The closest one can achieve is simply changing one's relationship to them, which is not to mention the problem of how to boycott women as a woman, how to opt out of yourself. I'm thinking of this opting out of yourself, the last resort when you realise the impossibility of opting out of anything else. Depersonalisation is both the sensation of being alien to oneself and the zooming out of the lens to realise that it's not just you. In their essay on the future of trans politics, Jules Joanne Gleason and Nathaniel Dixon write on disassociation, the clinical sibling of depersonalisation. There is a certain double entendre to talking of dissociation, which we wish to tease free. At once, the condition can be understood as an individual state, a shroud of distancing from the world or the senses. But also, the impact is one that plays out collectively, a glazing of the eyes and connected vagueness that causes us to overlook potential sources for camaraderie and coping, even as they stare us in the face. In responding to Coast and Baum's question, is abstraction a transcendental escape from identity or a psychotic spasm of depersonalisation, I would say that Lozano suggests abstraction is a transcendental spasm of depersonalisation. There is no escape from identity, and yet to depersonalise is to ascend and see clearly that there is nowhere to go, at least not alone. Lozano took the highest low road, and in the process exposed the fallacy that there is ever really a choice when it comes to the road of identity, highlighting the flaw in the idea that a subject position is an ethical position, or at least comes with a free one. Identity is necessarily an abstraction, and to be a gendered subject in the world is to be an abstraction trapped in an abstraction. And to make this explicit is to, at least for the moment of refusing to be served by the woman at the gas station, to know where one stands side by side with oneself.